All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we have one more speaker who will give a talk here, but please do not disappear after this because we have lunch, of course, and also some parallel sessions. All right. So now we have Professor Steve Lansing. All right, he is one of the two directors of the Complexity Institute here, and well, this conference on complexity of time is organized jointly by Paralimus and the Complexity Institute. So Steve is also one of the organizers alongside Jan. So Professor Lansing is an anthropologist who holds many responsibilities worldwide, as you can check out the booklet. One of his recent works has to do with self-organized criticality with regards to agriculture in Bali. And I think it is intriguing that Professor Lansing is involved with the development of having the water temples in Bali to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That's such an achievement. So anyway, let us now invite Professor Steve Lansing to give his talk.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Jan, for this opportunity. This is a brand new talk for me, and new questions, and so I'm very interested and curious, and I feel very delighted, actually, that I have the people who are here in this room to see what you make of it. So please don't hold back with questions as I go forward. I'm going to be explaining population genetics and anthropology in ways that I have not done before, with lots of physics, too. So anthropology is an evolutionary science. It's all about time, and we make up most of it, well, what are our materials for understanding time in anthropology and the origins of us? Mostly it's archaeology. But now we have these tools of population genetics. So probably everybody in this room has thought a bit about your own personal DNA, because we know that the news is coming, that eventually the doctors are going to get to be much more precise because they can read our DNA. We carry our histories in our personal DNA. But here, what we're talking about, what I've been doing with my colleagues here, is trying to understand DNA at the level of whole communities. And from that, we can ask different questions. So here we go. It is deep time. Harrison wrote this. Many people don't know him. Maybe he's an interesting man. This was in response to the 2,000-year-old tradition in the study of humanity, by humanity, of stadial models. You know, that things progress. The Greeks believed that things move in a steady progression. He's really responding at that point to Hegel, one of the last incarnations of that notion, that time moves forward in a straight line. And Harrison begged to differ and said, actually, that would be boring if everything happened in the same predictable pattern. So what else can we see? So population genetics, relatively new field, let's just say a very rapidly changing field. And it basically answers two kinds of questions: migration histories of populations and also their demographic histories. A rich field, for us, forms the scaffolding on which we can ask anthropological questions. So the anthropological questions are a little more precise than who got where. There are things like, did cultural rules guide social relations in the deep past? In other words, in the time before memory, in the time before records. What can we know about cultural rules and social organization? If they existed, then what were they? In the past, did social hierarchies exist? Male? Female? How long? How strong? What did they do? Did elites have more children? Lots of questions we can ask. Did that drive migrations and the movements of populations? How much of that can we pull out by using the combination, really, of archaeology and the new data we get from genetics? And finally, how do languages travel through time? Endless speculations about language and the evolution of language, you know, the formation of our species. How did it actually move around through time? So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so. Darwin wrote about it right away. You know, the formation of different languages and distinct species are curiously parallel, and in fact, they're not just parallel. Every human brain needs a language, and those languages have to be transmitted by parents, basically, from parents to children. So there's a continuous process which creates a co-phylogeny of gene trees and language trees. And that's what we'll That's what I'll take you through in just a moment. So think about language. Languages are interesting from this sort of genetic perspective because language change is astonishingly regular. These are the languages of the Pacific. This is the Austronesian language family. Each of those is a language. The breadth of the triangle indicates divergence, which is measured in a very simple way by changes in the words. So we collect a list of words from a language, and we compare it to another adjacent language, and we see how different they are. Well, look at the rates, okay? Very, very similar. In fact, those rates, the replacement of cognates, words that have the same meaning, is usually more regular in language than it is in biological, in genetic phylogenies. And that's kind of weird because in genetics, it's a biochemical process of mutation that causes change. But languages change, not in my brain, but in my interaction with other people who speak my language. And that should be so regular from language family to language family is something for which we have no explanation. The result is that we can trace languages, language families back. This is very controversial among historical linguists, but essentially about 5,000 or 6,000 years, after which you lose the signal. The cognates have all kind of drifted apart. We don't know why that's the case. So Edward Sapir, the great linguist, wrote this lovely line, language moves through time in a current of its own making, but those words have to be traveling, right, through people, and that means down gene trees. So the question is, can we see any further? Can we see back before the current languages existed if we have no written records for them? How, indeed, do languages travel through time? So these Austronesian languages, until the modern era, those are the languages of the Pacific, and they were the largest language family on the world, extending from Easter Island, Hawaii, all across the Pacific, most of the Malay archipelago, and even to Madagascar, a fact that was noticed by James Cook on his first voyages into the Pacific, where he discovered that you could pick up a navigator in one island and travel a few thousand miles, and he would understand what's being said in the next island. So how the devil could that be? Sir Joseph Banks, the first president of the Royal Society, went along on that voyage, and he made this point in his journal. He listed Tahitian and Maori words side by side and showed that they were closely related. That was the beginning, it's one of the beginnings of historical linguistics. And then he said, but how any communication could have ever been carried out between Madagascar and Java is amazing. I mean, across the Indian Ocean. All right, so a century after Cook's voyage, Alfred Russel Wallace wrote his wonderful book after his voyages in the Malay archipelago. And he also puzzled over the spread of Austronesian languages in the islands of the Malay archipelago. The reason it's a puzzle is that he already knew at the time that Alfred Russel Wallace was writing, that those islands had been occupied earlier, before the Austronesian-speaking. The people who colonized the Pacific came from South China, and they arrived no earlier than about 4,000 years ago. Those islands were occupied much earlier. So what happened to the languages before the Austronesians arrived? The best that Alfred Russel Wallace could come up with is, well, there must have been a single great migration through the islands, which of course was the obvious deduction. Okay, I'm going to now trying to think, how can I explain our methods? And I thought I'm just going to show you a 10-minute video we did for the National Science Foundation, which explains what we're up to. So
in 2009, we discovered that one of the largest barriers to human migrations, equivalent to the Sahara or the Himalayas, occurs in the middle of a continuous chain of islands that were first colonized about 55,000 years ago. In the absence of physical barriers to gene flow, there must be another explanation. The break occurs along Wallace's line, the famous Pleistocene boundary between Asia and Australasia. These are Asian Y chromosomes. They quickly disappear east of the Wallace line. Y chromosomes are carried only by men. X chromosomes spend twice as much time in women as in men, and more of the X chromosomes cross the Wallace line. But was this a small effect? Consider the population of the island of Flores, east of the Wallace line. The mitochondrial DNA, which is carried by women, is almost completely Asian. The X chromosomes, which spend twice as much time in women as in men, are mostly Asian. Autosomes are recombined in a process we call sex, half from the father and half from the mother, and they're about half Asian. Finally, only a very few of the male Y chromosomes are Asian. We see this pattern on one island after another, and it grows stronger as we go east. So what happened to the men? The Pacific was explored by small numbers of voyagers in sailing canoes. By tracing the genetic evidence from their modern descendants, we made a surprising discovery. For unknown reasons, few Asian men crossed the Wallace Line. And there's a second mystery. When the Austronesians arrived in the islands, they brought their languages with them. But nearly all of the islands were already inhabited by people who spoke their own languages. Yet nearly all of those original languages disappeared. Within a few thousand years, Austronesian languages, carried by small numbers of colonists, replaced the indigenous languages on hundreds of islands across half the globe. How did that happen?
That's how this project began. I thought that if we could collect both language and DNA samples from the islands that were the stepping stones for the Austronesian migration, then we might be able to tease out the different histories of men and women. But for that, we would need more samples.
My colleague, Herawati Sudoyo, is the executive director of the Ekman Institute for Molecular Biology in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. Hera's goal is to map the genetic diversity of the archipelago, but most of her work has to do with medical genetics. But like me, Hera was surprised to discover that the Wallace Line was a barrier to Austronesian males. So we decided to try to reconstruct what happened when the Austronesians arrived on the island of Sumba. Sumba lies just to the east of the Wallace Line, and traces of the Austronesian culture are everywhere, in stone monuments to the ancestors and in the languages and DNA of the Sumbanese people.
We're in the village of Waimangura in northwest Sumba. Public health staff and the team from the Eichmann Institute are collecting health histories, talking about malaria and hepatitis, answering people's questions, and collecting some samples. But I'm going to be asking questions about language. There are 8 domains in West Sumba, each of which has its own individual language, most of which are unintelligible from one little domain to the other. There's even one region just to the north of here where there's a language that's spoken by people in only 3 villages.
Are all the languages of Sumba Austronesian? Do they all trace back to a single mother language brought by the Austronesian colonists? To find out, we need to collect samples of language variation and use them to reconstruct the history of all the languages of Sumba. This is East Sumba, July 2005. This tape is going to have the third of 3 tapes containing word lists.
Ke, minum, hemu, chow, dog, ikan,
berenang, ngan, gigit, witi, jilat, jali.
186 terbang.
Take the English word to fly. It would be translated differently in each of the languages of Sumba.
Nawurna, 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 nawurna.
Tavuruna, navuruna, tavuruna, navuruna.
Nawurungo, 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 nawurungo.
haurung, 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 haurung.
Haurung, 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 haurung.
So far, the linguistic evidence suggests that all of the languages of Sumba fall into 5 regional clusters, and they all derive from a single Austronesian language which would have been spoken about 3,000 years ago.
In Sumba, for the first time, we were able to put together genetic information and historical linguistics to track the Austronesian colonization of a single island more than 3,000 years ago. We did this by focusing on the village level, tracking the spread of words and genes from one village to the next. But we're left with a large unanswered question. What was the role of Austronesian women in the colonization of the island?
Today, the culture of Sumba is dominated by men. But we know that in the past, at some point, women played a much more important role. So when and where did that change begin? On the island of Flores, just to the north of Sumba, there are said to be some matrilineal villages where descent is traced through the female line and women have a lot of power. Could those villages be relics from the time when the Austronesian culture began to change and women assumed more power? We decided to go to Flores and take a look. This village of Bena in the mountains of central Flores looks a lot like the villages in Sumba. We've got the houses with the tall thatched roofs and the stone tombs to the ancestors just in front of them. But there's an important difference. The villages in Sumba are patrilineal, the men are in charge, whereas here this village is matrilineal. It means that the houses are owned by women, that both men and women inherit their rights to property through their mothers, and so the matriline is stronger here. The question we want to ask is, what difference does it make?
Biasanya, Bapak, kalau yang diturunkan berdasarkan ibu, itu warisan biasanya diberikan lebih banyak kepada anak perempuan, misalnya. Nah, apakah di sini juga terjadi hal seperti itu?
Ya, memang ini sudah turun-temurun sejak dari kami punya orang tua.
Ya.
Tapi yang peranan adalah perempuan, sedangkan bagaimana perempuan itu untuk pengeluaran atau omong apa-apa, kita harus satukan dengan saudara-saudara orang tuanya itu.
In Bena, women have a lot of power. It's one of a handful of matrilineal villages where women own things like livestock and land, and children inherit from their mothers. But when we analyzed the genetic samples from Bena, we learned that the matrilineal villages on Flores are only a few hundred years old. So the genetic samples from Bena are much too recent to tell us anything about the Austronesian voyagers. But there's still another chance. On the island of Timor, just to the south of Flores, deep in the interior, there's another cluster of matrilineal villages. And there's reason to believe that these villages are very old, much older than the matrilineal villages on Flores. Here in Wehali, men still think of themselves as warriors. But as in all matrilineal societies, they share power with women. There are written records from the colonial era that prove that Wehali was a matrilineal center before the first Europeans arrived in the islands 400 years ago. In the center of the innermost village, there's a sacred dwelling for the female rulers of Wehali. The lady to my side here is an Imea. It means she is the ruler of Wehali. So literally dozens of villages will send delegates here if she calls them. This is a matrilineal society. So it means that women own land and property. And so she is the one who ultimately has the choice, the decision to make about how that land and that property will be allocated.
Ai bawa ciro lai, amne hatu forai ne bawa ceraba setuba, ne harwe ne tos, roh hero lai be, ha ne pova, hatu durai besire, numa ne sira sai ne sira roh fohai, peto si hai be fo, imhotu tu loi tu wane si mes itene fo. In this matrilineal society, there are no patrilineal clans. That makes a big difference in the way that the genes flow down through the centuries. The mitochondrial DNA, which everyone inherits from their mother, stays in the community. In the islands of the Pacific, that's the pattern that we see. The genes tell us that the Austronesian women stayed together,
and sailed all the way to the furthest islands. But what happened to the men?
Well, here in Wehali, we might have a model. In other words, they have a myth that the world was an ocean, and then people settled on that in a small island which gradually grew. Now, suppose that were something like the truth. In other words, these voyagers arrive on an island, they establish a settlement there. The women stay put. The women inhabit these villages, and they marry with the local men, and then eventually they send out daughter settlements to the next island. And that way they could sort of hopscotch across the Pacific, and in the end you'd get the pattern that we see, which would mean that the original Austronesian voyagers, the whole expansion could have been driven by matrilineal societies.
When we analyzed the DNA from all the islands, it confirmed what we discovered in Wehali. About 3,000 years ago, Austronesian voyagers from Asia reached the islands of eastern Indonesia, which were already populated by Papuan hunter-gatherers. The Austronesians built new matrilocal villages just like Wehali. Soon, Papuan men began to marry into the Austronesian villages. Their children would grow up in their mother's village, speaking her Austronesian language and carrying her Asian DNA. But these children would also inherit Papuan DNA from their fathers, and that's exactly the genetic pattern that we see. Thanks to the DNA provided by the islanders, we've uncovered a story that would otherwise have been lost, probably forever. We think of the butterfly effect as triggering chaos, but here it's just the opposite. Over tens of generations, a tiny shift in marriage practices triggered a seismic change in language and culture that spread across half the globe.
Yeah, so the competing explanation was for, why didn't the Asian men get out to Hawaii, is that the Papuan men must have attacked them. It's either that or the women got bored of them and threw them out of the canoes. But neither of those explanations explains why Austronesian languages took over. So we have a nice peaceful explanation. Here's a little phase portrait. Here's the 2% or so of the marriages each year are from Papuan men, adjacent communities, who move into the Austronesian-speaking community, enjoy their wife's property, have children, contribute their genes to the next generation, and the next generation is going to pick up their mother's language. So if you run that forward 50 generations, then here's what happens to those three independent genetic systems, right? As we're just going through time here, over time, the Y chromosomes change. Here's the beginning point, here's the end point, this very slow process by which there's gradual language replacement and change in the genetic composition of the population. So that's our explanation. Okay. That was a start. But we wanted to see if we could go deeper. Yes?
May I ask one question?
Sure.
I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but I read some of the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. And he looks in Amazonia at tribes and shows that there were a number of tribes which were dominated by female. I mean,
yes.
And so, is there a connection? I mean, sometimes we say that some of the population of South America went to Easter Island, and is that possible that there is at least some relation or some parallel?
That's exactly where we're going, to look at can we answer that question, the relationship between men and women in the future, in the past, in this society. So let me carry on and see what you think. So we pick up the question of languages, and we will get to kinship presently. So the question is, how long do these chains of transmission last, going from parents to their children, from mothers or fathers to their babies? Okay? And the notion of a co-phylogeny is every language, if a language disappears in one generation, it's gone forever. These are pre-literate societies. So how is language transmitted through time? When does language change? Because we don't all speak one language, right? There's language variation of these regular processes. How can that come into existence? How can that be? So here's a co-phylogeny. The blue are the genes, and the sort of yellowish thing are the languages. So here is a language. Here's English, tracking down through time, and then switching over and becoming the language of Singapore by people who a couple of generations ago would not have spoken English. Okay? So we simply track the movement of languages through descent by asking people what language they speak and then taking their DNA. So to do this, we collect the Swannish word lists that you saw in the video, those 200 word lists where we can distinguish the relationship between languages based on their cognates, how similar they are in terms of their word. That's the standard method for historical linguistics. So we got lots of them. And then having acquired them, we can compare the process of transmission on a couple of interesting islands. So Sumba is an island here that is exclusively patrilineal and patrilocal, meaning that women move into the villages from outside. Here in Wehali, which you just saw, is the matrilineal, matrilocal complex that still exists in Timor, where the women sort of partly rule, and from time to time they accept husbands from the surrounding communities, some of which are Papuan. So that dynamic still happens here. And here in Timor, we've got 5 different languages. So we collected data, start with Wehali, from 11 villages, from 507 men. The reason we do that is we need to characterize the population histories of these communities so they can be compared. That's different from what geneticists usually do. They go to hospitals or schools and they collect data up from individuals. They don't really care very much about where they came from. But for us, we want to be able to work out the history of these communities. So in this case, we've got, see the next picture. Here are the different languages spoken. You can see there's a lot of variation among them. And we can ask, how are they traveling through time? We do that by building phylogenies based upon the genetics of each man. So I take Brian's DNA and I work out his phylogeny, his ancestry, on his father's side through the Y chromosome, and on his mother's side through his mitochondrial DNA. And I also ask him, which languages does he speak? And I know he speaks German, and he speaks pretty good English and Irish. I don't know. Anyway, so we put those languages down here, and if we've got only one language, then it's just orange. But if we've got 2 or 3, then in this band, we have each of those languages represented. So those are the languages spoken by this man. And he is also over here, the same, I should pick this guy. Over here is the same man. We're looking at the transmission of languages to the same person, but we're looking also at the relatedness of the individuals who speak a common language. And if you just glance at this, there are 2 bands here. This band, the upper band, is exactly what languages do you speak. I just asked each of you what languages do you speak, and we'd color them in, right? But then we'd also see how many languages do you share. And if you're a group of brothers, then we're going to have a band like that, okay? If you're closely related on, what is this, the mother's side, then we're going to follow a tree, which is going to show that you have been inheriting the orange language through the mother's side. Over here, through the father's side. And if you just glance at this, at the distribution of those 2 bands, you'll see that they tend to be bigger over here than over there. We can compare the distribution. This is the key point. Okay, we're looking at 2 different pathways of transmission through time. So let's look at the mitochondrial DNA. This is transmission from your mom, okay? Here are the languages. Again, here are the colors. And here's time. Now I need the pointer because look up that tree, okay? Click, click, click. Most of those people are speaking the same language. Over here is a clade that's shared a language, and that goes back about that far. How far is that? That's into the Pleistocene. That's 15,000 years ago. Okay? There's the Pleistocene. We can go arbitrarily back in time with these phylogenies, with these gene trees, and as you'll see here, we see large blocks. Whoops, come back. Okay, we see large blocks where, for example, these, where most of these guys have wound up speaking the same language. There are a few who speak different languages, but by and large, we see steady transmission. We're not seeing, if that were not the case, we'd have these colors scrambled all over the place. If people shifted languages quickly, then this would be lots of colors. Instead, what we see is large blocks of color, and we can compare the size of those blocks by transmission through the mother's side or the father's side. So that surprised us. We got 5 different languages, so we have enough statistical power to actually make some sense of this. Okay, so what's happening? Well, here are the villages of Weihali. It's quite simple that the chain of language transmission will break when someone speaks a different language than their parents. When people marry into new speech communities, if they stay in the same speech community, then their parents and children will continue to speak the same language. What causes a break is a movement. Someone moves in and marries into a different community, then the children adopt the language of either their mother or father, depending on which it is. Okay? So children learn a new language. That's how languages move between clade. A clade is a line of descent lines. Here they are, learning a language. Okay? So chain of language transmission breaks. So just to clarify this point, or really sort of emphasize it, there are the languages spoken by the close kin, patrilineal and matrilineal. In the patrilineal case, there's more host switching. This is in the matrilineal villages where men are moving in Timor. Men are moving in, so languages shift more often there from the father's side. Okay, smaller groups. So let's just pull that pattern apart, that dynamic. Choose 2 men in the village and ask how closely related are any 2 men in the village on the father's side and on the mother's side. That is going to depend upon their marriage system. We don't mate randomly, especially in the tribal world. We follow the rules. So what are the rules? Well, suppose it's patrilocal. The men stay in the village. Women marry in from outside. If it's from far enough outside, they'll bring in a different language. Here's the result. This is genetic distance. Here we have, on this we will put a point for someone depending on how closely related they are on their mother's side and on their father's side. Father's side from the Y chromosome, mother's side from the mito. So we can do this for everybody, right? We can say, how closely related is this village? What would be the consequences? Well, if this is matrilocal, you could get an extreme result like this. Over here, the women in the village, very closely related. But if the men move in, if most of the men have moved in from a large catchment, then you're going to get that large spread. You see, there'll be much more variation on the father's side than on the mother's side. Here we go. Much less related. The men are strangers, the women stay put and they bring in husbands. Okay, so there's a portrait. Here's a matrilocal community. There's a patrilocal community. It's the opposite. On the patrilocal side, the men are closely related, the women are coming from a large catchment. Okay? So those are little portraits. This idea was proposed by Professor Stefan Turner, right there, as a way to capture this information and make comparisons at the scale of communities to infer their kinship systems. So here we go. One more case. If we have no bias in movement, so everybody just stays put in the village, marrying no distinct pattern, people just marrying within the village or the surrounds, then you get a pattern like that. They're equally related on both sides. And as time goes forward, the group will get larger, and they'll be less closely related just by the passage of time. Okay? More descendants, larger circle. Okay, so what do we actually see? Well, here's Weihali, a village on Timor, matrilineal, matrilocal, the one in the movie. And here's 2 kind of peaks. These people are more or less closely related at about the same degree to each other. But over here, we see this very large signal. Most of these people reflect the pattern in which the mitochondrial distance, they're closely related on the mother's side, but there's lots of variation on the father's side. So we see a signature for pattern of men moving into that matrilineal, matrilocal village. Okey-doke. There they are. Is this typical? Well, here are the genetic distances for all of the 11 villages in Weihali, all 537 men. Mostly we see a very strong signal for matrilocality. It happens, however, that we sampled in 3 patrilocal villages, just north of the matrilineal kingdom. So here they are. They don't show that signature. Instead, people are mostly related equally on both sides. Okay, so now we can look at the consequences for language. So imagine that everybody's carrying a language with them, and we simply ask what language, same question, what language do you speak? So I've colored the dots now based upon shared languages, languages that they have in common. And as you can see, the signal is very strong. There's a strong signal for, well here, I think the next slide even shows this more clearly, but there's the matrilocal signal. There's a patrilocal signal for Wehali. I'm going to press ahead because we get a much clearer comparison if we shift over to the other island. This is the patrilineal patrilocal community, the patrilineal island. These guys carry swords. They import women from elsewhere. They are fiercely patrilineal. Lineage is everything for them, right? Okay, so what's it look like there? Well, their languages are extremely diverse. Each of those colors is a different language. So we're sampling the communities that speak these languages. Patrilineal Sumba. In Sumba, they build a village consists of clan origin houses like those. Each clan, each patrilineal clan builds a beautiful house like that where they pay homage to their ancestors, perform their rituals, and celebrate their patriline. So this is a place where patrilineality really means something, okay? So in the shade of those houses, or often underneath them, women weave textiles. The textiles identify not my clan, but my language group, interestingly. People who speak the same language will wear those clothes, which means you can recognize them as possible marriage partners, or anyway, closely related to you in some way. All right, so here we are in Sumba, and here's pattern of relatedness in a village in the far west of Sumba. Here's the Y chromosome distance. These guys are brothers. They're very closely related, and they're bringing in women from a very large catchment. Okay? If we compare them with Timor, what we've just seen, you see these two clear differences reflecting time. Okay. And again, now we can add language, how the shared languages among those pairs, and we see this pattern. It's even stronger, actually, that shared language signifies an even closer bond than shared kinship. These are people holding on to their language. So there they are. Here are all the villages, like Rorschach tests for the villages. Just to summarize, okay, we see then these patterns of transmission, and here we simply calculate what would be the consequences, how departures from random, we build a model and we say, let's let languages switch randomly through time, and let's compare that with the observed distributions, and we'll see how far apart they are. How random is this process? How distant is it from randomness? So to do that, we calculate the rate of host switching. Host switching just means how often does a language move from one clade, one descent group, to another. If it happened every generation, it would be a complete mess. If it never happened, then everybody would be speaking exactly the same language. So what do we see? Here we have 8 different genetic systems, mitochondrial and Y lineages on 2 islands. So it's 8 different independent systems in which we can ask that question, how fast do languages, how often does a language switch from one branch to another? Here's the answer. They're on very rarely, very rarely, all 8 cases. And in fact, if you increase the language switch rate to like 1 or 2%, then we lose the signal. In other words, it becomes randomized. So this surprised us, and I wouldn't show you this slide if it were only one lineage, but it's all 8. So we think this is pretty solid information. We're talking now about over 1,000 men in 38 villages or so. It's a very large sample. And what it means is there's a 50% chance of a host switch on a clade in 6,000 years. The implication is that it happens so rarely that there may be groups of men or women who've been passing on the same language, staying together since the Pleistocene. Now, how could that be? I mean, languages don't last that long, right? They change very rapidly. The way that could happen is if, when a language is replaced, it isn't done by random individuals. A whole group of kinsmen pick up a new language for whatever reason. It either drifts into a new kind of language or they adopt it for some reason, but they do it collectively. And if you think about the relationship between language and culture, it's interesting because language is culture in a way, especially in the pre-literate world. Language has words for everything in the culture, or very close to everything in the culture. If the word drops out of the language, that concept, that idea, that thing, is also disappearing from the culture. So here is a transmission of culture. The beauty of language is everybody always has at least one language, and there's a faithful transmission through the parents' line. So what we think we see is, what we imagine is, villages may form and change. We know that villages usually don't last more than a few centuries on these islands. We can tell that from the archaeology. But when they disperse, when they change, groups of related individuals stay together. And they stay together over these really impossibly long time scales. I mean, the Pleistocene, all of the islands down here completely changed, right? With the end of the Pleistocene, the sea levels rose, and what was formerly a continental landmass became the islands of the Malay archipelago. I'm not saying that we know that those groups stayed together. I'm simply saying this is what this evidence suggests, that for very long periods of time, groups of kinsmen stayed together. And that would have implications then for the transmission of culture, right? For language changing, culture changing, but these people, if they're staying together and they're sharing a common language, presumably they're carrying the rest of their cultures with them. So that was an interesting. I look forward, we haven't yet published that. I guess no, we just did actually publish this. We'll see what my fellow anthropologists think of that claim, because it is surprising. Okay, so clades, which means groups of kinsmen or kinswomen, apparently often remain intact longer, much longer than languages exist. That's the implication. Okay, I should move along here. So part 3 is language and society. That, by the way, that's more of Sumba. It's a great job, anthropology. Anyway, so back to Alfred Russel Wallace. Here's what we've just been trying to understand. Each of those dots is the genetic composition, not of a person, but of a village. Okay? So what we've just done for individuals, we say in this community, this particular blue one, the heterozygosity, the variation in women is large, but they are closely related on the father's side. So Sumba and Timor, you'll notice that there are 2 patterns that look almost like mirror image. And we're trying to understand how that could be. How is it possible that these separate islands with different cultural rules, different dynamics, different histories would wind up with these almost mirror image patterns? So that takes us to the last part of this talk. Timor red, you got it? Every one of these is a Timorese village, and we see this bias, but it varies from one village to the next. They're not all the same. It's a historical bias. Sumba is blue. Okay, so what do? We simulate models to try to explain it. Here we simulate migration. The story I've been telling you so far is that at some rate, husbands move into matrilineal villages, or wives into patrilineal villages. Assume that's happening at a rate of 2%. Then what we have here is the heterozygosity. This is, that's got to be Timor, that's got to be Sumba. We can account for, by creating these populations and allowing the villages to be created, and then enabling them to intermarry based upon this migration rate, what do we see in the simulation? And the answer is it doesn't even begin to span the variation that we see. So just migration, the explanation I've been giving you so far, really doesn't do it, okay? Doesn't work. So we increase the migration rate from 2% to 10%, it still doesn't work. What to do? Well, another theory about human social life that could create this skew in reproduction is dominance. So it's like the central dogma of behavioral ecology, that the reason men compete is the reward for competition is to have more wives and more children. That there's selection for male dominance, and the effect of that is dominant individuals. Here's time going forward. Here's the chief, and here he is. I'm the chief. Let me be the chief. Okay, I'm the chief several generations back, and I'd propagate Lansings generation after generation because my children inherit that tendency. Over here we have just ordinary people, and that is a random process. So let's assume some level of dominance and see if that will help the model. So we add dominance, and yeah, it does. It extends the range in which we can predict the level of heterozygosity, but only about half as far as we need it to go. So that hasn't quite worked either. What else might have an effect? And by the way, there's another problem. Female dominance, as far as we know, doesn't exist anywhere, let alone with the strength that we see it on Sumba. So we have a problem, right? The mirror image problem. So female dominance does exist, so maybe what we should do is go look for evidence for female dominance. But wait, we need to test further possible assumptions. So we simulate lots more dominance anyway. We combine migration with dominance, and it has a minimal effect. Okay, I'm winding up here because we now finally get to a more complicated model. So this is a phase portrait of several interacting processes to see if we can assess their effect individually and in synchrony. So here they go. The first of them is a standard population genetics model called this island model. We simulate a lot of villages that are at equilibrium, nothing much changing, and then we add migration, we add dominance. There is no historical memory to this system. We just let the thing run. But then we also create a budding model. This is based on the work of archaeologists in the region, like Peter Bellwood, who say that villages grow, they create daughter settlement. And Peter, who's leading archaeologist of the Pacific, really, says there's an ideology we see across the islands that high-ranking individuals leave home to create new settlements. The idea is we have a village. It must be a village, right? And we'll make Jan the chief. It means that the other chiefs are going to be subordinate to him, and so some of them may want to go off and form a new village. And so that, if we assume that founder-focused ideology persists through time, then you'd have another way in which heterozygosity would diminish as a result of the budding process selecting for smaller groups. Serial founder effect. Okay, so we can compare those models, and this is kind of as far as we've got. Here's island model, individual villages at equilibrium, and here's the budding model where they're growing and spreading, creating daughter communities. The budding model does a good deal better in the simulations, right? The dots are the real data, the simulations are here. You can see it's doing better. And adding dominance to the model increases the power with respect to the males, but it doesn't do much for the females. Maybe we just solved the problem. We don't have to go look for female dominance because our best model at this point doesn't require it. Male dominance, yes. Female dominance, no. Okay? So these are both poor fit, the island model, the budding model. The archaeologist model seems to be the one that works best. And yeah, okay? Simulating female dominance has little effect. To our knowledge, this kind of comparison hasn't been done before in population genetics. They occasionally test for specific effects, but not for combined. Basically, this is a phase portrait. This is looking at all the different possibilities. Here's the island model as a phase portrait. Ning Ning Chung. Are you here, Ning Ning? There's Ning Ning Chung. This is Ning Ning's phase portrait. She's a postdoctoral student in the Complexity Institute and a theoretical physicist. So here's Ning Ning's model. This is a rather complicated model, but the idea is the real data falls in here. What we're trying to do, this is called a Slatkin test. We're trying to see what magnitude of reproductive advantage, tendency for elites to have more children, in conjunction with different migration rates, will take you to this zone of the real world. In other words, we have, the Slatkin test says, what are the departures from a random heterozygosity? Here's reality. And here, she's running repeated interactions, running the whole model many times over at different levels to see where we are. Okay? So there's the model. Here's the founder model. It's essentially the same principle. So it's a way in which, okay, so that's that. So what have we learned? I'm out of time. Looks like my claim is we can answer a lot of we just scratched the surface on the anthropological questions that we can ask by looking at community scale processes, languages, and DNA. It will also be possible to ask questions about other things that are transmitted, like diseases and resistance. And we begin to do that now with a company called Genentech. So sticking to the anthropology, we can ask, did cultural rules guide social relations? We can say something about that through time. And what they were, matrilineal, patrilineal, those, we're attaching numbers. You don't have to believe my story about kinship in the past on those islands because we've got some real data to look at the magnitude of these processes of marriages and migrations and so forth. Social hierarchies, yes, we see evidence for them. We can simulate that. We can look at the data. We can begin to understand social hierarchies going back a long way into the past. Did elites have more children? Yeah, looks like. And did that drive the migration process? These all become questions that are to which we can ask and then test with empirical data. So that's the story. And then languages traveling through time. So this work was done by Hera, you saw in the film, the executive director of the Ekman Institute in Jakarta, and then Guy Jacobs, who's not here because he's frantically finishing a paper about Denisovan admixture in these populations. You're not here, right, Guy? And Ningning, here, and Cheryl Bundu, another student, Lakyu Chu, theoretical physicist here, Stefan Turner. A lot of this, the physicists will recognize that a lot of these methods are being adapted from physics. And I think I've covered everybody. Murray Cox, a computational geneticist. Okay, that's my story. And I'm very curious to know if it made sense, because as I say, it's a new one. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm curious about the female dominance, that it doesn't really work out. Is that because if you're a lady, you can only have so many children, and if you're a man, you can father as much as you want if you have a lot of women?
Right. That's exactly the conversation we had when we saw these results. That must be the reason. But if female dominance exists, we can imagine scenarios in which elite women have more resources and their children do better. And so over time, it's possible to have a scenario in which elite women would, there would be a real effect. That could happen even though men have an advantage in terms of how many, the possibility to have lots of sons. Yeah. So, these are kind of open questions. I'm just showing you the state of the data that we've got now. Maybe one of the take-home points is this is all driven by cultural rules, right? And so we would expect that in other parts of the world, in other cultural systems, in other social systems, all this could play out very differently. We're not looking at universal patterns. We're just looking at what we see here. And those will be hypotheses to be examined elsewhere, I think. I hope. Yeah.
So you started with even the quote from Darwin about language evolution and genetic evolution.
Yeah.
And language, of course, has all these different things where there's not really fitness, and there could be bilingual, trilingual people, and so on. But
yes.
My question is, the language, it seems almost all of your interesting results were coming from the population genetics side, and what you know about the relationship of different languages in these language trees, you're more explaining that rather than that helping confirming this, or did I misunderstand the role of the language data?
I think what we're doing, we're not providing any information about the evolution of language except the social context in which it occurs. And that we're bounding. That we're saying, look, if languages changed every few generations, that would have different consequences. Languages presumably had to have time to develop syntax, and then there has to be enough contact between different language groups so that from time to time they would change. And so I think our model is maybe not altogether surprising if you think about what it would be required for the regularity of language change that we observe to exist. And so prolonged periods in which languages are shared and develop in situ, but then also contact with other groups, even at small frequencies. So I think what we're doing, I think we're handing to the linguist some information about the historical persistence and the social relations that are on which language had to exist in these islands. I mean, it may be very different elsewhere. Brian.
Yeah. What a lovely talk. Real scientific sleuthing, a lot of data, and beautiful technical work. I have two quick questions. One is that you seem to have pairs of rules, you know, dominance, no dominance, female dominance, male dominance, etc. And there are several possibilities. If you take the number of different combinations of all those rules, could it be that just by pure statistical chance, one combination tends to fit better? It's like an analysis of variance. By chance, something's going to fit much better. So do you feel on solid ground statistically that it's not just luck that's showing one combination? The other question is that years ago, Merritt Rulin, the linguist, postulated that we all go back to some Ur language, roughly about the length of the Pleistocene, maybe even deeper than that. How do you feel about, it was poo-pooed a lot by linguists. What would be your stance given that you're showing something quite similar here?
No, wait a minute. I don't think we're showing a newer language at all. We're just showing the persistence of languages that are constantly changing along clades. So what we see is the persistence of change, really.
Okay.
We see that very clearly in these islands. These languages drift apart very rapidly. I mean, you know, on the time scale of centuries and a few millennia, and they're totally different, right? So what we're able to now is to kind of look back into the past and see, did that have to change a few thousand years ago? Do we see any evidence for replacement, for major changes? And we simply don't, based upon the phylogenies, based upon the persistence of these clades. And as for the statistical power, but I think even the first example, which is the simple model, the little simple model of the colonization of the Pacific, we have 4 different genetic systems, all of which change at a very slow time scale. But that is the genetic, those are the 4 genetic patterns that we see. They're characteristic right across the Pacific. So any explanation for the colonization of the Pacific needs to come up with some explanation for that. It also needs to come up with an explanation for the replacement of indigenous languages with the Austronesian languages. So our explanation does that. And I think we said it, you know, any other explanation would have to account for those facts as well. I mean, on the one hand, this is hand-waving over large periods of time, but on the other hand, we can make pretty strong claims if we can make comparative statements about cultural level, you know, about genetic patterns that appear over large swaths of time and space. Yeah.
Talking about the colonization of these islands, we have the most powerful colonizer of them all, namely the Portuguese, and in particular in the island of Timor. Has that, surely that must have some effect on the whole story, because you have these groups, none of them, I mean, they are all like orders of magnitude less powerful as colonizers, as the Portuguese. So surely that must have some traces of impact, right? Has that been looked at?
Sure. I mean, the Portuguese language is still there, but in the case of Wehali, the matrilineal kingdom, we have Portuguese records from the 17th century, and soon after the Portuguese discovered Wehali, they decided they needed to conquer it because they understood that it was a kingdom. And so they came in and they burned down the houses and conquered Wihali, but it made no difference because it's not a kingdom. You know, it's a different kind of social organization. It was essentially superfluous. I mean, it was an interesting commentary, I think. Historians writing about this say, look, they thought they were conquering a kingdom, but the people of Wihali at the time must have been puzzled as to why they wanted to burn down the houses. What were they accomplishing by this attack? But no, indeed, in the very recent past, the last few centuries, absolutely, the Portuguese had an enormous effect on Timor, and indeed we see that. One of the villages in our picture is the village of Raimanawi, where we have, over the course of the last 40 years, lots of migrations from Timor, and we can see them actually. We can distinguish them because they bring in different languages. You can see clumps. I could show you the little picture, right? We can see the genetic and linguistic evidence for that process of the creation of a new village of refugees in Raimanawi on the border between East and West Timor. I mean, all those things will leave, movements of people will leave signatures. Movements of languages will leave signatures. Any other? Yes?
In the beginning, you mentioned the Wallace line, right?
Yeah.
So that the Y chromosomes are less Asian across it. So did you explore that when you were comparing the patrilineal villages of Sumba and the Wihali matrilineal villages? Or
well, that we believe that happened a long time ago, and so that determines the genetic profiles. But in the subsequent research on kinship systems, we're talking about things that are more recent. There's no question that the Y chromosomes, Asian Y chromosomes, are much less common as you move out into the Pacific. It's just a fact, known it for a long time. So maybe it's about time, really, right? I mean, what we're looking at is processes that occur at different time scales, and with the genetic data, we can test. You can date them. Molecular clocks enable you to ask, when did this clade separate from that clade, right? Those branchings are datable, and so you can ask questions about change. Doug.
So one of the things that you didn't really discuss are the clan system, and from that I infer that the clans must be relatively simple, and they're not. It's not another variable that's somehow going to bias us. Because if you live in the southwestern U.S., you'd also have to map the clan relationships in order to look at the same patterns of descent, because they don't map exactly to the kinship systems.
But actually, we are seeing the effects of the clans. In Sumba, there are patrilineal clans, and they will tell us today our kinship system is we bring in women, and what we can do is look at the genetics and see that.
So villages don't have multiple clans that are the way you would have it in the Pueblo villages in the Southwest, that would somehow cut across the kinship relationship.
Right. Interestingly, there are the pattern across eastern Indonesia is clans which are the anthropologists refer to as houses. Levi-Strauss christened them, Society à Maison, and each clan will make marital alliances with others, and that can be both patrilineal or matrilineal depending on which island you're in. So that's different. As in Sumba, you saw those lineage towers, right? They're separate, but they will intermarry. Different from like the Hopi, there are lots of other communities where there are relations of intermarriage within villages. In this case, it's much more, our village creates ties with other villages, and that's a form of alliance, right? That strengthens us. So we have bride wealth connecting us to other villages. It's just a different kinship system. Yeah.
So I found it fascinating. I mean, that's my first time hearing your talk. I'm still trying to integrate the amount of information. But if I understand correctly, the differences in languages are measured by the sort of a pronunciation or phonological distance across words. And I was curious, since you mentioned that you may have appearance or disappearance of concepts, whether you went as far as trying to link these aspects also with the same methods you're using?
No, interestingly, I think interestingly to me, there's a standardized word list, the Swadesh word list. And so you take a word like sky. So in Indonesian or Malay, it's langit, and it becomes langi. It becomes rangi, the sky god in part of Polynesia, and lango. All those words are connected. And if you do a simple calculation, you can say how closely related are they, right? Just those simple phonological changes. So you merely tabulate those 200 words. And they are standardized across all historical linguistic comparisons, so that makes it easy. But some words sometimes stand out. They don't drift at the same rate as others. And in this case, there are a few that are like that. Mother, father, the paired symbolic contrasts, which are important to their rituals and their sense of cosmology, those don't drift. Ama is father and Ina is mother from Sumatra to Tanimbar Islands. Younger and older, tip and trunk, metaphors of growth are retained. Those concepts are retained, and they're deliberately retained. It's quite extraordinary. All the way across these remote islands, they still maintain those words. The others drift. So there's definitely there's another dynamic involved in the conscious retention of cosmological symbols. Yeah. As Levi-Strauss predicted. Am I keeping everybody from lunch? Okay. Just one second. Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was just wondering if there is any impact on the trading that is happening during those times, and if there are also impacts on availability of resources in that area, in terms of the produce, or is there anything with regards to some higher level governance body that is coordinating the relationship between these villages?
Yeah, this was a major topic from about the 30s with Dutch and French ethnologists, the dynamics of the alliances between clans, between houses. And we see very similar patterns over large stretches, basically from one end of Indonesia to the other, the tribal areas. Very different in Java and Bali, where they grow wet rice, and where very different dynamics involving the management of that, system come into play. Those houses disappear. Those alliances between clans disappear. Everything changes in Java and Bali. Clearly that has to do with the population explosion and the changes that were created by wet rice agriculture. But in the tribal islands, where horticulture, where there is no wet rice, basically, then it's remarkable how durable this system of economic organization has been.
One or two of your slides, you have an earlier slide that talk about Tahitian and some Indonesian language, Javanese, right? Yes. Javanese. And then, in the next breath, basically, then you talk about, I think it's Javanese and Madagascar, or Java and Madagascar. So I couldn't link the two, because Tahiti obviously is far away from Madagascar, which is close to Africa, right? Yes. Part of the African continent. What was the point that you were trying to make there?
This was the observation of Sir Joseph Banks when he went along as the scientist, basically, on Cook's first voyage into the Pacific. And he noticed that the languages are very similar, and he just did this comparison, writing down the cognates and seeing how similar those words are. And then later on, they learned that the languages of Madagascar also belong to this family. That was found out almost immediately, and he said, how could it be? I mean, the distances are so vast. How could that possibly be? It can't be true. And in fact, it was true. Recently, my colleague Murray Cox, and anyway, they've now traced the genetic link to Madagascar. It looks like a couple of boatloads of Austronesian women got there, and now the genetic composition of the Malagasy people shows that very strong signal. So languages and genes got as far as Madagascar. Yes?
So with the linguistic data, you talked about this word list of 200 words in the cognates. But there's there's the potential of a lot more linguistic information about morphology and syntax. So are there also attempts to look more broadly at the full richness of languages and try to understand relationships and evolution?
Absolutely. We're looking at just one small bounded question, hoping that it may be relevant to linguistics. We would lose the capacity to make these very broad-scale, coarse-grained comparisons if we tried to incorporate syntax or more complex aspects of language. So we're just seeing how far we can get with this very basic data. It's extremely. So what we're learning is very limited. It's just a little more information about how language moves through time. Thomas.
Yeah, this use of language as sort of a historical record, is this something you worry will only be useful for the next few decades, after which the rise of global communication will start having non-local propagation of languages and destroy these sort of local migrations? So for example, it's possible to learn a language now thanks to the internet without ever coming face to face with someone who speaks that language. And so in this sense, a language can propagate without any migration of people. And so even if it doesn't replace your native language, it can still. So take Singapore, for example. In conversation here, you see a mixture of English, Chinese, Malay, all happily integrated in one collection. This then sort of, I'm not going to say pollutes, but it changes the language from its kind of original tongue, and so it's like a non-local thing that will destroy any migrational record.
This already happened centuries ago. It's the Malay language, which is Indonesian is Malay. That is the language that is spoken from one end of Indonesia to the other. It's why I can go and talk to people, because it's everybody's second language or their third language. So that has happened, but it hasn't erased these local languages. It just becomes everybody's. We didn't even take statistics on how many, on asking people whether they speak Malay or not, because everybody speaks Malay, at least to some degree. Three villages speak one language. If you only spoke that language, you would have a very limited social life.
Okay, but I mean, do you not worry that as these sort of languages become more and more dominant in that? So for example, you have in a lot of these colonial countries, the main language ends up becoming the the colonial power that came and dominated them, and then this supplants the original native tongue. Would this not happen with the internet just as a non-local colonizer of culture?
Well, it's conceivable, but Malay has not done that. I mean, Malay has not had that effect over in the islands. What I worry about is not the hegemony of language, but the continued expansion of the oil palms, which are destroying the biodiversity of all those islands. I mean, I have to say this, I guess, having gone to the islands, it's just the rate of ecological devastation in those islands is extraordinary. The last beautiful islands, if they're not already being converted to palm oil plantations, they expect to be. So in our generation, we're seeing the loss of the greatest terrestrial biodiversity, planet Earth. It's here, it's in this region. And when we go to these remote, we've been going to lots of islands by now. It's like 22 islands. You just see the same process everywhere, which is not an answer to your question, just an editorial comment. We need to pay attention. Time for lunch, or?
There's still time, yeah.
Looking at the travel, it appears that only at least until in ancient times, men were the ones who used to travel rather than women, because from far places. So it looks like not feasible for women to have actually gone to Madagascar. Now we can see this to some extent, how men traveled from Europe and from India to this part of the world, and when they traveled, they actually settled in places and they took on local women and they married them, and the language of their children was actually the mothers, and this can be found in Malaysia, in parts like in Malacca and so on. Yes. Even the Portuguese who came to Malacca, their children, I mean, they claim they are said to be Portuguese today, but they speak Malay with a little bit of maybe some Portuguese. So the language seems to live from the mother, especially in these kind of areas. Now, looking at your particular think 5,000 over years ago, a time when I believe there wasn't really some set civilization. I find it very difficult to understand how there could have been such harmony where the women could have actually influenced and so on. It would have been more a time of men coming and taking women, right? Like what happened in the way that the barbarians came, the Huns came.
Mm-hmm. It's an interestingly different story, isn't it? That matrilineal, matrilocal societies spread across the Pacific. The last great human expansion into pristine environments over half the globe was carried out. We can certainly see women not only were part of that, it looks like they were dominant. In these societies, we think it's hard to, there's a controversy about this, but it looks likely that the original Austronesian expansion was of matrilineal, matrilocal societies. So it's quite a different story. It isn't that nice. You know, we need a little variety in these narratives. Okay, I think it's time. Oh, no, we don't have lunch yet. We have closing remarks, I think. Is that right? But maybe, perhaps there was one last question?
Okay, thank you. I wonder, did you conducted similar investigations to the village in Sulawesi?
We've been gathering data on Sulawesi. Yeah, we've tried to, Herawati Sudoyo and the Ekman Institute in Jakarta is trying to map the genetic diversity of Indonesia, largely for medical reasons, so Sulawesi has been part of that. I've just been talking about really a small subset of the data in areas where we also know quite a lot about the anthropology.
Yeah, I mean that because the Sulawesi island, the Wallace line is passing through this island. And then, as far as I know, village in Sulawesi is different village, different language, totally different language, not different dialect. So it means maybe it's more diverse language there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it will be classified as an Austronesian language, but that is a pretty vague term, and it may well be very different. I mean, the languages change all the time, and so languages that are classified in one language family may, in fact, be, have drifted a long way from the original proto-language from that, the original language from which that language family was spawned.
All right, let us put our hands together.